Hey guys, so I decided to mix it up a little bit and have my own lecture in here for a reason. I decided that, we're kind of all over the place with big history because we go up and then we go, we kind of pull out, we go in, and I feel like sometimes there's no continuity. So what I wanted to do is take a moment to talk about context and kind of some causation factors of world history up into World War II. In fact, we're going to go just like slightly post World War II before we end up getting to the Cold War in our next little bit here, okay? So I basically threw stuff together in about 18 slides from the Industrial Revolution to World War II. So you're welcome. it's definitely a quick little review here, but I want to make sure that we're understanding how each part of history causes the other, to give a little bit of context before we get into the Cold War, because truly everything from the Industrial Revolution onward has a very direct causation factor, okay? What you will see attached with this is your boxes and bullets. You've never done boxes and bullets for me, but I like to do this sometimes for notes, because notes are for you. They are there for you so that you can understand the content, so that you can apply the content. And so I don't have you turn these in, as you will see, but I do have kind of a starting point activity there. I always have something to ponder at the very beginning. And at the end, there is a synthesis question that I ask that you fill in as well, okay? As you'll see, I have just kind of the very basic ideas that we'll be talking about. And then I also have two other bullets after that, and that's for you to record anything that you would want. I normally say you want to have at least 2 bullet points. You'll see that as I get closer to the end of my slides, I don't have quite as much content information to review with you. It's just going to be a quick hey, this is happening, and then we're going to move along. So record what you need. You can always have more than 2 bullet points. It's completely up to you, but that's usually the minimum, okay? So let's get started with the Industrial Revolution, okay? So what is the Industrial Revolution? It's really quite simple, my friends. Rather than making goods by hand, we're going to have machines that can mass produce our products. And this is going to lower the cost of producing goods, increase profits, and it's drastically going to change the way that people live. You guys did this through the urban game, right? So you guys got to see a little bit of what ends up happening with urbanization and some of the consequences thereof, okay? By 1900, industrialization really spreads through Europe and the United States, and it transforms the West into the dominant region in the world. Before this time, there was a lot happening across the world. We had great Muslim empires in the Middle East, and even in India. We had China, who was still doing fairly well, at least for a while, that kind of were vying for this power. And once the industrial era hits in about 1750, that is when we see that power struggle no longer be a struggle, I suppose. That's when we see the West in Europe and the United States. That's when we start to see them really transform into the dominant regions of the world, only because the other regions are not able to quite keep up. Okay, so where did this begin? This actually began in England, and the only reason really why the Industrial Revolution begins in England. There's a few reasons actually. They had our basic factors of production. They had the land, they had the labor, they had the capital. They had vast amounts of coal. They had access to water for water wheels and things like that. And so really it made a lot of sense, I suppose, that the Industrial Revolution began in England. Directly before this, we had the Agricultural Revolution. And the Agricultural Revolution, in all actuality, it's very short, but all it really means is that we now are going to be able to plant more food. Okay, and because we have more food, we have a population increase, which brings in more people in order to work, and that really spurs on this industrial era. Okay, so that's industry in a big nutshell. I mean, that's probably glossing over it super crazy fast. I know. Okay. So our conclusions here, really from the 1700 to 1900 revolutions in agriculture, like I was just talking about, industry, transportation, communications, changes Western Europe and the United States. In contrast, like I was saying, the economies of Asia and Africa were still very based on agriculture. They had very small workshops if they had anything going for products. industrialization, try that again, really revolutionized every aspect of society, from like daily life to life expectancy. And despite all the hardships of very early urban workers, like that they suffered, like population and health and wealth, it really ends up eventually rising dramatically in all industrialized countries. And so the development of a middle class also happens during this time. This creates really great opportunities for education and even democratic participation. And then greater democratic participation in turn ends up fueling powerful movements for social reform, which happened quite a bit into the 20th century there. Okay, so that is industrialization. I hope that was like short, sweet, and to the point for you, because we're moving on. Oh, whoops, hello. I forgot I had that on there, but we already talked about that. That military power, that was kind of on my last little slide there, that is what we need to talk about with imperialism, okay? And really there are two phases of colonization. And when you guys did your colonization project, I know some of you were talking about colonization like back in the age of exploration, when we're looking at the 1500s, 1600s, but there's this new kind of wave of imperialism happening from about 1850 till 1914. And 1914 is really that cut-off date because no one's really going to be focusing on taking over the world anymore in Africa and Asia, because they're going to have World War I. I know, spoiler alert, sorry about that. So what is imperialism? Because I actually, for whatever reason, it's really a difficult concept for us to think about sometimes. So imperialism is the seizure of a country or territory by a stronger country, and then that stronger country dominates weaker countries politically, economically, and or socially. And I only put that in, I should have and or on there, because sometimes there's like indirect rule where most of the time existing political and social structures are left alone, and the country that takes over really just wants, it seizes that other country or territory, really just wants that economic input, that factor, okay? So the big reason, well, the stronger country gains power with the money it makes from using the weaker country, and that in and of itself is imperialism. And so what's happening here, this is that direct cause and effect relationship, right? Industrialism, we got huge amounts of industry happening in Europe and in the United States, and it's causing us to realize that we need to have more resources. Our countries only have so many things that we can use in our factories, and so imperialism is kind of the solution to that. Some of these larger countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, right? They are desperately figuring out that they need those resources, and so they want to go in and take over. There were lots of motivations for taking over, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. So it wasn't just economically, but that's always the main thing, right? It's one of my two like universal truths of history. The other one's slightly inappropriate, so I'll just share this one, but it's always about the money. So it's always about the money. And anyways, that's just a big thing to understand, okay? So from this time period, the 1850, 1914, these strong industrialized nations, like I said, are competing for these, for these colonies in Africa and in Asia. And they end up kind of dominating and taking over. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, okay? So why? Like I just said, the Industrial Revolution leads to that huge demand for raw resources, so countries need to have more things. That's one of the biggest reasons, okay? But there's also another one. It's not just about the resources that they can provide, it's also we need to have markets to sell our goods. So a market is just simply a group of people that you can sell your goods to, sell your products to, okay? And so the Industrial Revolution really causes this demand. We need to have more people to sell our stuff to. And if you're like China had basically closed its doors for a very long time at this point because they didn't care, right? They were like, you know what, we feel like we're better than all of you. And so did Japan. In fact, Japan was like, we're closing our doors as well. But China fought some unsuccessful wars over opium, the Opium Wars. Good times. The British decided they would take opium or poppies, make opium. It's like an opioid, if you've ever heard of that. It comes from the same derivative, but at this time it was smoked, and they basically got like 10% of the population of China addicted to opium just so that they would have a market and a foothold in China. And unfortunately, China said, please stop doing that. And Great Britain was like, no. And so China decided they'd have to declare war on Great Britain. It was not pretty. They lost. And China was kind of carved up into what we call spheres of influence. Japan had a very different experience. The United States came over with some gunboats and pointed them directly at Japan and said, hey, yeah, you need to open up your borders for trade or else we're coming at you. And they were like, hey, I guess we'll open up the borders for trade. So good times. Okay, I know, I digress. So this really continues to fuel that industrial revolution, continually making Western Europe and the United States more and more powerful, okay? Excuse me. So why did other nations of the world decide to imperialize? Well, there's a lot of things happening here. In fact, you might have heard about them before, like nationalism, right? Nationalism in Europe really meant that each nation wants to become the most powerful and that they believe that they are entitled in some way, shape, or form to have these colonies, right? And again, having those colonies really shows a lot of that power piece, okay? There were other things happening as well during this time, like our missionary spirit and stuff like that. So like, in other words, people really want to go out and convert to Christianity. It's very, very similar to that idea or those ideas presented in colonization. Sorry. Anyways, so like in colonization, we talk about kind of the 3 G's as the main motivator: God, gold, and glory. And really, it's very similar, just different names. Like the glory is for your nation instead of personal glory. So that's nationalism, right? Yeah, we still want the quote unquote gold, but it's not really all for gold. It's about getting those raw materials. It's about having people to sell things to. Again, I told you, it's all about the money. And we also have that idea of God. We want to go out and we still want to spread Christianity to what Europeans considered, the uncivilized world, and we have to civilize these people. Okay, that was actually part of their mantra. We got to civilize people. It's the white man's burden. That's what they called it. To get out and actually talk to them about all sorts of stuff, not just that, but health and anyways. And speaking of which, I guess we should really talk about the consequences. So we talked about causes. So what are the effects? This is kind of like the overall legacy of the colonial rule and imperialism. So negative effects of colonialism. Well, as you could probably guess, Africa lost their land. A lot of people died from disease. There was loss of African traditional culture. There were many, tribal areas that were placed within countries, and these tribes have been literally warring with each other for maybe hundreds of years, and now we're putting them in the same actual political country together. And that really was not a very good thing because it actually caused more and more conflict, and still causes conflict today. In fact, speaking of, there's also famine from subsistence agriculture to cash crops because Africans were told that they needed to have things that they could sell, not things that was actually going to feed them. So if you're wondering why there's so much famine in Africa today, a lot of it actually comes directly from this colonial period, this imperialist period from our Europeans, because they completely changed the way in which Africa had been living for hundreds of years. Okay. So there were some positive effects of colonialism, so I don't want you to get super depressed here, but there were fewer local wars. It did cause still some serious tensions though, which we'll talk a little bit more when we get to our contemporary issues and things like genocide, but there were fewer actual local wars. Literacy rates rose because we're actually teaching people to read and how to read and in different languages and things like that. There was introduction of sanitation practices, hospitals, schools, so education was a thing. And then of course there were economic benefits for the Africans, like railroads, dams, telephones, telegraph lines. I guess it was telegraph and telephone, but still, okay? All right, guys, so this is just your first part. We are going to get into World War I, the between the wars, World War II, and post-World War II. So if you need to take a break, go back, finish up your notes a little bit. That sounds great. And then make sure you go and click on that second part that I will have on here. I'm hoping, pretty positive, I can get it done in another 15 minutes, okay? Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks so much.